My name is Alexandria and I'm 26 years old. Right now I'm standing in what used to be my father's house, but today the deed is in my hands. 6 years ago, I found my Harvard acceptance letter torn to pieces and scattered across my bedroom floor like confetti at a funeral. My father stood in the doorway and said girls don't need degrees, they need husbands. Now he's outside on the doorstep, begging me to let him in from the cold. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how my grandfather orchestrated the perfect revenge. Before we begin this story, I want to know where you're watching from today. If you believe education should be for everyone regardless of gender, hit that like button right now. And if you want to hear how a grandfather's brilliant plan brought justice to a family torn apart by control and abuse, make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens when 3 generations collide over one young woman's dreams. Let's dive into this incredible journey of betrayal, resilience, and the sweetest revenge you'll ever witness. I was 18 years old and standing at the top of my graduating class when everything I'd worked for came crashing down. For 4 years, I'd maintained a perfect GPA while juggling AP classes, volunteering at the local hospital, and tutoring underprivileged kids in math and science. My dream wasn't just Harvard, it was becoming a doctor who could help families like the ones I'd grown up watching struggle in our community. My mother Claire had been my secret ally through it all, squirreling away money from her part-time job at the library and even selling her grandmother's jewelry piece by piece. She'd hide $20 here, $50 there, building what she called my freedom fund in a bank account my father Robert didn't know existed. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in April while my father was at his construction company. I'll never forget how my mother's hands shook as she handed me the thick envelope, tears streaming down her face as she whispered that all our sacrifices had been worth it. We danced around the kitchen like teenagers, and my younger sister Emma, only 16 at the time, joined us in our celebration. Mom had even bought a small cake that she'd hidden in the back of the freezer, chocolate with crimson frosting that spelled out Harvard bound. We were careful to clean up every crumb before 5:30 when we heard Dad's truck pulling into the driveway. That evening started like any other, with Dad demanding his dinner be ready the moment he walked through the door. But something was different about me. I couldn't hide the joy radiating from every pore. When he asked what I was so happy about, I made the fatal mistake of telling the truth. The transformation in his face was immediate and terrifying. He stormed up to my room, and I followed, watching in horror as he tore through my desk drawers until he found the acceptance letter I'd carefully hidden under my calculus textbook. What happened next plays in my mind like a slow-motion nightmare. He read the first few lines, his face growing redder with each word, before he began ripping the letter into smaller and smaller pieces. Girls don't need degrees, he shouted, they need husbands who can provide for them. You think you're better than your mother? Better than me? His words hit harder than any physical blow as he scattered the pieces of my dream across my bedroom floor. When my mother tried to intervene, suggesting that maybe we could discuss this as a family, he grabbed her by the arm and literally dragged her to their bedroom, locking her inside. I could hear her pounding on the door, begging him to be reasonable, but he was beyond reason. Emma stood frozen in the hallway, tears rolling down her cheeks as she watched our father destroy everything I'd worked for. The ultimatum came next. I had 2 choices. Marry Brandon Mitchell, the 28-year-old son of his business partner, or leave the house with nothing but the clothes on my back. Brandon was everything I despised in a man, arrogant, entitled, and known around town for treating women like possessions. But my father saw dollar signs where I saw red flags. A merger of families meant a merger of construction companies, and I was just collateral in his business expansion plans. When I tried to explain that I had a full scholarship, that this wouldn't cost him anything, he laughed in my face and said the decision was already made. Brandon had been promised a wife, and that wife was going to be me. That night, after my father had gone to bed satisfied with his declaration, my mother managed to pick the lock on their bedroom door with a bobby pin. She found me sitting on my floor, trying to piece together the torn letter like the world's saddest jigsaw puzzle. That's when she delivered the second blow. My father had discovered the Freedom Fund. My Aunt Martha, his own sister who I'd trusted with our secret, had seen a bank statement at our house and immediately told him everything. The account had been emptied that very afternoon, $17,000 meant for textbooks and dorm supplies and the start of my new life, gone into his business account. The next 72 hours were critical because Harvard needed confirmation of my acceptance or they'd give my spot to someone on the wait list. I tried everything I could think of. I attempted to use the family computer, but my father had changed all the passwords. My phone disappeared from my nightstand, and when I tried to walk to the library, I discovered he'd called ahead to ban me from using their computers. Even my laptop, which I'd saved 2 years to buy, met its end under his hammer in the garage while he made me watch. He'd taken time off work just to guard me, ensuring I had no way to contact the outside world. My prison wasn't made of bars but of his suffocating control. What made everything worse was discovering that this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. My father had been planning this for months. He'd already told Brandon's family that the wedding would be in June, right after what should have been my high school graduation. He'd put deposits down on the church and reception hall using money from my college fund. My future had been sold before I even knew it was on the market, and everyone in his circle of business associates and poker buddies had known except me. The betrayal cut deep, but it was only the beginning of the nightmare that would unfold over the coming weeks. 3 days into my imprisonment, a ghost from our family's past appeared at our front door. My grandfather William had been estranged from our family for 10 years, ever since a bitter fight with my father over my grandmother's funeral arrangements. I watched from my bedroom window as the tall, silver-haired man climbed out of a pristine black Mercedes, his movements deliberate and dignified despite his 73 years. What I didn't know was that our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chin, had secretly contacted him after witnessing my father's explosive reaction to my college acceptance. She'd lived next door for 20 years and had finally seen enough. The confrontation between my grandfather and father was volcanic. I pressed my ear against my bedroom door, which my father had locked from the outside, and listened to their voices rise and fall like thunder. William accused Robert of repeating the same controlling patterns that had driven my grandmother to an early grave. My father shot back that William had no right to interfere after abandoning the family for a decade. The argument revealed layers of family dysfunction I'd never fully understood. My grandfather spoke of how my father had treated his own mother, keeping her isolated from friends, controlling every penny she spent, and preventing her from pursuing her passion for painting. The parallels to my current situation were impossible to ignore. When my grandfather finally left, seemingly defeated after my father threatened to call the police if he returned, I felt my last hope drive away in that black Mercedes. But William Hartford was far from finished. What nobody knew, especially not my father, was that my grandfather had spent his career as a federal judge with connections throughout the legal system. His decade of absence hadn't been about nursing wounds, it had been about building a case. 2 days later, I received a sign that he was still fighting for me. My English teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, slipped a note into my textbook during one of the few times I was allowed to leave my room for homeschooling. The message was simple: your grandfather knows. Help is coming. Trust the process. The secret meeting that changed everything happened at my friend Sophia's house. My father had reluctantly allowed me to attend what he thought was a bridal shower planning session for Brandon's cousin. Instead, I found my grandfather waiting in Sophia's living room, looking nothing like the frail old man who'd left our house defeated. His eyes sparkled with intelligence and purpose as he revealed the truth about his life. Not only had he been a federal judge, but he'd accumulated considerable wealth through smart investments and his late wife's inheritance. Then came the shocking revelation: my father had stolen $500,000 from him years ago through forged documents and fraudulent power of attorney papers filed while my grandmother was dying. William had hired a private investigator named Jake Morrison, a former FBI agent who specialized in financial crimes. What Jake had uncovered about my father's business dealings made my blood run cold. Robert's construction company, which he proudly claimed was built on hard work and honest deals, was actually founded on a web of fraudulent contracts. He'd been bribing city inspectors to overlook code violations, using substandard materials while charging for premium ones, and skimming from every project. The investigation revealed offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands holding millions in hidden assets, clear evidence of tax evasion spanning 15 years. But the most damning discovery was his connection to Brandon's father, Mitchell Sr. Their partnership went far deeper than construction. They were involved in a sophisticated money laundering operation, using construction projects to clean dirty money from illegal gambling operations. Jake had photographs, bank records, and even recorded conversations that painted a picture of corruption that reached into City Hall. My grandfather had been patiently gathering this evidence for 3 years, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. My Harvard acceptance and father's violent reaction had provided that moment. The plan William outlined was brilliant in its complexity. He would continue playing the role of the senile, defeated old man, making occasional visits where he would seem to beg for reconciliation while actually documenting my father's behavior. Every interaction was being recorded through devices Jake had planted during a supposed maintenance visit by a heating company that grandfather owned through a shell corporation. Meanwhile, William had been making contact with FBI agents who were already investigating the money laundering ring but needed an inside source to make their case airtight. What touched me most was learning that my grandfather had been watching over us all these years. He knew about every school play I'd been in, every award I'd won, every time my father's temper had sent my mother to the emergency room with mysterious injuries. He showed me a box filled with newspaper clippings of my academic achievements, photos taken from afar at my track meets, and copies of report cards that my grandmother had secretly sent him before she died. He'd wanted to intervene sooner but knew my father would only escalate if confronted without leverage. Now, finally, he had that leverage. The meeting ended with grandfather giving me a burner phone hidden inside a hollowed-out library book and instructions to document everything. He promised that by the time my father's planned wedding date arrived, Robert Hartford would be facing something far worse than family embarrassment. As I hugged my grandfather goodbye, feeling his strong arms around me for the first time in a decade, I realized I wasn't fighting alone anymore. The man my father had dismissed as weak and irrelevant was actually a strategic genius who'd been playing the long game. The hunter was about to become the hunted. My father's paranoia reached new heights after grandfather's visit. 2 months before my high school graduation, he made the unilateral decision to withdraw me from school. The principal, Ms. Davidson, tried to advocate for me, explaining that I was valedictorian and deserved to walk with my class. But Robert Hartford's word was law, and he threatened to sue the school for interfering with parental rights. Instead of preparing for finals and graduation speeches, I found myself imprisoned in his construction company office, forced to learn what he called wifely duties. This included filing papers, answering phones with a pleasant voice, and most humiliatingly, serving coffee to the leering men who did business with my father. Brandon began showing his true nature during these office visits. He would corner me in the supply closet, running his hands over my body while whispering about how he would train me to be the perfect wife. His words made my skin crawl as he detailed his expectations. I would quit any job aspirations, produce children on his schedule, and learn to keep my mouth shut at social gatherings. When I tried to push him away, he'd grab my wrists hard enough to leave bruises and remind me that in 3 weeks, I'd be his property. The way he said property, like I was a piece of real estate to be developed, told me everything I needed to know about my future if this wedding happened. My mother's health deteriorated rapidly under the stress. The vibrant woman who had once dreamed of being a teacher herself became a shadow, jumping at every sound and developing a tremor in her hands. She stopped eating regular meals and would stare into space for hours. I watched her pop anxiety medication like candy, prescribed by a doctor who was another one of my father's poker buddies. When I tried to talk to her about fighting back, she would just shake her head and whisper that resistance only made things worse. It broke my heart to see her so defeated, but I understood her fear. She'd lived under his thumb for 20 years, and the learned helplessness ran deep. My sister Emma became my unexpected ally during this dark period. At 16, she was tech-savvy in ways our parents couldn't comprehend. She began secretly recording our father's abusive rants on her phone, hiding it in her pocket or placing it strategically around the house. The audio she captured was damning: threats of violence, admissions of financial crimes spoken carelessly over dinner, and most importantly, his explicit statements about forcing me into marriage for financial gain. Emma would transfer these files to the cloud using the school computers, building a digital arsenal that would later prove invaluable. The second major betrayal came from someone I'd trusted completely. Megan Chen had been my best friend since 3rd grade. We'd shared everything from first crushes to dreams of escaping our small town together. So when she offered to help me contact Harvard using her family's computer, I didn't hesitate to accept. What I didn't know was that my father had approached her parents with an offer they couldn't refuse: $10,000 to report on my activities. The Chens were struggling with medical debt from her brother's cancer treatment, and my father exploited their desperation. When I showed up at their house with a drafted email to Harvard admissions, Megan's mother called my father immediately. The punishment for this escape attempt was swift and brutal. My father dragged me to our basement, a cold, damp space used for storage, and locked me inside. For 3 days, I sat in darkness with only a bucket for a bathroom and whatever food Emma could sneak down when he wasn't watching. But those 3 days of hell turned into an unexpected blessing. Among the boxes of old records and forgotten junk, I discovered documents that my father had carelessly stored and forgotten about. Financial ledgers showing 2 sets of books for his company, receipts for materials never used in construction but billed to clients, and most damning, correspondence with city officials discussing bribes in barely coded language. I memorized every detail I could: account numbers written on manila folders, dates of suspicious transactions, names of shell companies used to move money. My eidetic memory, which had helped me excel in school, now became a weapon in my arsenal. When Brandon visited on the 2nd day of my imprisonment, drunk and emboldened, he made the mistake of bragging about his father's connections to organized crime figures who used their construction projects to launder money. He thought I was broken, defeated, too scared to ever use this information. He was wrong. The third betrayal came from an institution I'd thought would protect me. Our church, where I'd been baptized and confirmed, where I'd sung in the choir and taught Sunday school, turned its back on me completely. Father Murphy, who'd known me since birth, agreed to counsel me about my rebellious behavior. But instead of offering spiritual guidance or protection, he lectured me for 2 hours about honoring thy father and the sanctity of marriage. When I tried to explain the abuse, showing him the bruises Brandon had left on my arms, he suggested I must have provoked him somehow. He'd already agreed to perform the wedding ceremony and made it clear that my consent was irrelevant in God's eyes. The glimmer of hope came through Emma's bravery. While I was locked in the basement, she'd made contact with someone who could actually help. Lauren, Brandon's ex-fiancée, had reached out through social media after hearing about our engagement announcement. The story she shared chilled me to the bone. Brandon had put her in the hospital twice during their 2-year relationship, once with a broken orbital bone and another time with internal bleeding. She had police reports, medical records, and photographs that documented a pattern of escalating violence. But Brandon's family had money and connections, and the charges had been mysteriously dropped both times. Lauren was living under an assumed name in another state, still terrified he might find her. As the wedding date approached and my father made preparations to sell our family home and move us all to Brandon's compound-style estate outside town, I realized the trap was nearly complete. My grandfather's plan needed to move faster, or I'd disappear into a life of domestic servitude and violence. The burner phone hidden in my room became my lifeline to the outside world, as I documented every threat, every controlling action, every piece of evidence that could help build the case. What I didn't know was that Jake Morrison had been busy recruiting allies within my father's own organization, employees who'd grown tired of his bullying and illegal demands. The pieces were moving into place for a showdown that would destroy the careful facade Robert Hartford had built over decades. My first real escape attempt came 10 days before the wedding. Grandfather had orchestrated everything perfectly through Jake Morrison. A fake ID with the name Sarah Williams, a bus ticket to Boston, and a contact at a women's shelter who would hide me until we could safely get me to Harvard. Emma created a diversion by faking severe stomach pains that required my mother's attention, while I slipped out through the basement window at 3 in the morning. My heart hammered against my ribs as I walked through the empty streets, every shadow potentially hiding someone who might recognize me. The bus station was only 2 miles away, but it felt like crossing a continent. I made it as far as the ticket counter before my world crashed down again. The night clerk, a man named Tommy Morrison who I recognized as one of my father's poker buddies, looked up from his newspaper and smiled coldly. Well, he said, reaching for his phone, Robert's little runaway. The betrayal shouldn't have surprised me anymore, but somehow it still stung. My father had anticipated this move and stationed his network of good old boys at every possible exit point, bus stations, train terminals, even the small regional airport. Within 15 minutes, my father's truck screeched into the parking lot, and I was dragged back home like a fugitive. The punishment this time went beyond imprisonment. My father made me watch as he destroyed my laptop with a sledgehammer in the garage, the device that contained 4 years of academic work and my carefully saved Harvard correspondence. Each blow felt like it was landing on my dreams themselves. But his rage wasn't satisfied with property destruction. When my mother tried to defend me, suggesting that perhaps we should seek family counseling, he grabbed her by the shoulders and shoved her toward the stairs. The sound of her body hitting each step will haunt me forever, followed by the sickening crack as she landed at the bottom. We called an ambulance, and I rode with her to the hospital, holding her hand as she drifted in and out of consciousness. The diagnosis was grim: 3 broken ribs, a severe concussion, and a hairline fracture in her wrist. When the emergency room doctor asked how this happened, my father spoke before anyone else could, explaining how clumsy Claire had always been, how she'd tripped over the cat. The doctor, a young woman named Dr. Patricia Kim, clearly didn't believe him, but when she tried to speak to my mother privately, another doctor intervened. Dr. Richard Brennan, golf buddy and recipient of referrals from my father's workers' comp cases, took over my mother's care and ensured the incident was recorded as an accidental fall. Back home with my mother sedated and helpless, my father presented me with a stack of papers to sign. Through my tears and exhaustion, I tried to read them, recognizing words like matrimony and covenant. These weren't just wedding preparations. They were legal documents that would bind me to Brandon in ways that went beyond marriage. My signature would authorize him to make medical decisions for me, control any future earnings, and most chillingly, commit me to psychiatric facilities if he deemed me mentally unstable. When I refused to sign, my father grabbed my hand and forced the pen into it, but I managed to scrawl illegibly, hoping it would invalidate the documents. The situation escalated when Brandon decided to move into our house for what he called security purposes. He took over our guest room and made himself comfortable, treating our home like his personal domain. On the 3rd night of this arrangement, I woke to find him standing over my bed, reeking of whiskey. His intentions were clear as he started pulling at my blankets, muttering about getting a preview of his wedding night. I screamed loud enough to wake the dead, and Emma burst through the door wielding a kitchen knife. "Get away from her," she shouted, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. Brandon laughed at first, but Emma's determination was fierce. She threatened to call the police and held her phone in her other hand, already recording. He backed off with a sneer, warning that in a week, no one would be able to protect me. The encounter with Brandon revealed another layer of betrayal that cut deep. Mr. Peterson, our family lawyer for over 20 years, the man who'd helped my mother set up my college fund and promised to protect my interests, had been working with my father all along. The prenuptial agreement he'd drafted wasn't just unfavorable, it was designed to strip me of all rights and autonomy. Every clause was crafted to ensure Brandon would have complete control over my person, property, and future. When I tried to contact Mr. Peterson directly, his secretary informed me that he could only speak to me with my father present, citing some fabricated conflict of interest. But grandfather's investigator Jake had been doing his own digging into Peterson's practice. What he found was a pattern of embezzlement stretching back years, elderly clients whose estates had been slowly drained, trust funds that mysteriously shrunk. Peterson had been careful, but not careful enough. When Jake confronted him with evidence of his crimes, offering him a choice between prosecution and cooperation, the lawyer folded like a cheap suit. He began secretly recording his conversations with my father, documenting the illegal instructions and requests to create fraudulent documents. The same man who'd betrayed me would become instrumental in bringing my father down. The surveillance network grandfather had established was paying dividends. Every room in my father's office was wired, every phone call recorded. The evidence was damning and extensive. Robert Hartford discussing bribes with City Councilman James Morrison, laughing about how easy it was to overcharge the city for road repairs that used substandard materials. Brandon's father outlining their money laundering scheme, unaware that his trusted lawyer was now an informant. Even more disturbing were the conversations about other young women, employees at the construction company who'd been harassed and assaulted, paid off or threatened into silence. My situation wasn't unique, I was just the latest in a pattern of abuse. As the wedding day approached with terrifying speed, I discovered one final horror. My mother, in her medicated haze, revealed that she'd written a suicide note. She showed it to me with shaking hands, apologizing for not being strong enough to protect me. I held her as we both cried, and in that moment of raw vulnerability, she revealed the biggest secret of all. Alexandria, she whispered, Robert isn't your biological father. Your real father was Daniel Foster, my college sweetheart who died serving in Afghanistan before you were born. Robert married me knowing I was pregnant, and he's held it over me every day since. You were never his daughter. You were just a possession he acquired along with me. The truth about my parentage explained so much about Robert Hartford's particular cruelty toward me. My mother's confession came with a flood of details she'd kept buried for 26 years. Daniel Foster had been everything Robert wasn't, kind, ambitious, supportive of her dreams to become a teacher. They'd planned a life together until his unit was ambushed outside Kandahar 3 months before their wedding. She'd discovered her pregnancy the day she received notification of his death. Alone, grieving, and terrified, she'd been vulnerable when Robert swooped in with promises of security and respectability. He'd known about the pregnancy from the start, using it as leverage to control her from day one. Through the burner phone, grandfather revealed that he'd suspected this truth for years. My grandmother had kept all of Claire's letters from college, including ones that mentioned Daniel and their plans. He'd hired a genealogist to trace Daniel Foster's family and discovered something remarkable. Daniel's parents had established a trust fund for any future grandchildren before their own deaths in a car accident. That trust, now worth over $2 million due to smart management, had been waiting for me all along. But Robert had hidden its existence, forging documents to ensure any correspondence went to a P.O. box he controlled. My real inheritance had been stolen before I even knew it existed. The wedding was set for Saturday, and by Thursday, the house buzzed with preparations I wanted no part of. But grandfather's messages through our secret channel gave me hope. The FBI raid would happen during the ceremony itself, maximum exposure for maximum impact. William had contacted journalists, ensuring media presence to document Robert's downfall. Every piece of evidence had been submitted, every witness statement recorded. The trap was set, but I had to play my part perfectly for 2 more days. The hardest acting job of my life was pretending to be resigned to my fate while knowing liberation was within reach. Thursday night brought another revelation that shook me to my core. Mrs. Washington, the wedding planner who'd been a family friend since I was 10, approached me during a fitting for the dress I'd never chosen. With tears in her eyes, she confessed she'd known about the forced marriage all along and had even helped Robert forge my signature on the marriage license. But guilt had been eating at her, especially after seeing my mother's injuries. She handed me a folder containing copies of every document, including ones that showed Robert had been planning this arrangement since I was 16. The paper trail revealed payments to Brandon's family, contracts that treated me like a business acquisition, and correspondence that made my skin crawl with its casual discussion of my breeding potential. The most shocking discovery came from Jake Morrison's investigation into my grandmother's death. What everyone had accepted as a tragic accident, a fall down the stairs remarkably similar to my mother's recent injury, now looked like something far more sinister. Jake had uncovered that Robert had taken out a massive life insurance policy on his mother just months before her death. The original investigation had been cursory, the coroner a friend of Robert's who'd ruled it accidental without autopsy. But a nurse who'd been on duty that night had always harbored suspicions. She remembered Robert's odd behavior, his insistence on being alone with his mother's body, and bruising on the victim's arms that suggested a struggle. This nurse, now retired, was willing to testify. William had suspected his son of murder but could never prove it until now. The pattern was clear. Robert eliminated obstacles to wealth and power, whether through violence or manipulation. My grandmother had been planning to change her will, leaving everything to William and cutting Robert out completely after discovering his abusive treatment of Claire. She died 2 days before the appointment with her lawyer. The parallels to my mother's accident were impossible to ignore, and I realized with cold horror that if this wedding happened, I might be next. Brandon's history of violence combined with Robert's ruthlessness created a perfect storm where my death would eventually be explained away as another unfortunate accident. Friday morning brought one final betrayal wrapped in false concern. Father Murphy arrived for what he called premarital counseling but what felt more like an interrogation. He'd brought Brandon with him, and together they spent 2 hours lecturing me about wifely submission and the sanctity of marriage vows. When I tried to speak, to explain the abuse and coercion, Father Murphy produced a document suggesting I suffered from pre-wedding hysteria and recommending psychiatric evaluation after the honeymoon. The paperwork was already signed by Dr. Brennan, setting up the framework for my future imprisonment in a mental institution if I proved too difficult to control. But unbeknownst to them, Emma had planted one of Jake's recording devices in the living room where this counseling session took place. Every threatening word, every admission of conspiracy, was being captured in crystal-clear audio. Brandon, emboldened by the priest's presence, spoke freely about his plans to break me properly once we were married. He referenced Lauren by name, laughing about how she'd learned her place eventually, not knowing he'd just confessed to crimes that would add years to his sentence. Father Murphy's complicity was equally damning as he offered to provide religious cover for whatever discipline Brandon deemed necessary. As Friday night fell and I stared at the white dress hanging on my closet door like a shroud, I held tight to the knowledge that tomorrow would bring either my destruction or my liberation. Messages from grandfather confirmed everything was in place. FBI agents had infiltrated the catering company, the photography crew included undercover officers, and even some of the guests were actually law enforcement. The country club where Robert had planned his triumph would become the stage for his downfall. I spent those final hours writing in a journal, documenting everything in case something went wrong. If I disappeared into Brandon's compound or a psychiatric facility, I wanted a record of the truth to survive. Saturday morning dawned with the kind of brilliant sunshine that felt like mockery given the circumstances. I woke to find my sister Emma already in my room, her face pale but determined. She helped me into the white dress that felt more like a straitjacket than bridal wear, her hand steady as she zipped up the back. "Remember," she whispered, Grandfather said to act normal until the ceremony starts. The signal will be when he stands up during the objections. I nodded, trying to calm my racing heart. 200 guests would witness either my enslavement or my father's destruction, and the waiting was agony. The country club looked like something from a magazine, all white roses and golden ribbons, a facade of elegance hiding the rot beneath. Robert strutted around in his tuxedo, accepting congratulations from business associates who had no idea they were attending their last free gathering. Brandon's family clustered near the bar, already celebrating their acquisition of the Hartford construction empire through this marriage merger. I noticed several unfamiliar faces among the catering staff, their movements too precise, their eyes too alert. The FBI agents were in place, and I felt a flutter of hope beneath my terror. Brandon appeared at my side as the photographer arranged the wedding party, his hand gripping my waist possessively. He'd been drinking already, whiskey on his breath at 10 in the morning, and his touch made me want to crawl out of my skin. "You look beautiful," he slurred, his hand sliding lower until I stepped away. "Soon you won't be able to step away," he whispered, his smile cruel. I forced myself to remain calm, knowing that within an hour, he'd be in handcuffs. The photographer, who I later learned was an undercover federal agent, captured every moment of Brandon's inappropriate touching, evidence of assault that would be added to his charges. Grandfather arrived precisely at 11, playing his part perfectly. He moved slowly, leaning heavily on a cane he didn't need, his shoulders stooped in apparent defeat. Robert barely acknowledged him, too busy basking in his perceived victory to notice the sharp intelligence in William's eyes. My mother, heavily medicated on Dr. Brennan's orders, sat in the front row like a beautiful ghost. Emma stayed close to her, ready to shield her when chaos erupted. The church filled with guests who represented the web of corruption Robert had spun over 2 decades, dirty cops, bribed officials, business partners who'd profited from his schemes. The ceremony began with Father Murphy's sonorous voice echoing through the space. I walked down the aisle on Robert's arm, feeling like Anne Boleyn approaching the scaffold. Each step took enormous effort, my body screaming at me to run while my mind insisted I had to trust the plan. Brandon waited at the altar with a smirk that promised years of pain, flanked by groomsmen who'd participated in covering up his past crimes. The music swelled, the guests smiled, and I wanted to scream that this was all a performance, a tragedy dressed up as a celebration. When Father Murphy reached the part about speaking now or forever holding their peace, the air in the room seemed to freeze. Grandfather rose from his wheelchair with surprising vigor, his voice carrying the authority of his decades on the bench. "I object," he declared, and with those 2 words, everything exploded into motion. FBI agents burst through every entrance, weapons drawn, badges flashing. Federal agents, nobody move. The scream of sirens outside mixed with the shocked cries of guests as officers moved systematically through the crowd. Robert's face went from confused to furious to terrified in the span of seconds. William strode to the front, no longer the broken old man but a force of nature. He carried a thick folder that he presented to the lead FBI agent with theatrical flair. Inside was everything. Financial records, recorded conversations, witness testimonies, proof of murders and assaults and decades of corruption. "Robert Hartford, you're under arrest for tax evasion, money laundering, conspiracy to commit fraud, and suspected murder." The agent's words rang out clear and strong. "Brandon Mitchell, you're under arrest for assault, attempted sexual assault, and conspiracy." Brandon's father tried to run but was tackled by an agent posing as a bartender. The chaos was absolute. Guests scattered, some trying to flee only to be stopped by agents at the exits. News cameras appeared as if by magic, Grandfather's media contacts ensuring every moment was captured. I watched Robert being handcuffed, his face purple with rage as he screamed about his rights, about this being his daughter's wedding. "The daughter you were selling to cover your crimes," Grandfather countered loudly enough for the cameras to catch. "The daughter who earned a full scholarship to Harvard, which you destroyed because you couldn't control her success." But Robert's arrest was just the beginning. As FBI agents worked through the crowd, more arrests followed. City Councilman Morrison was dragged out in handcuffs. Dr. Brennan found himself face down on the country club's marble floor. Even Father Murphy wasn't spared, arrested for conspiracy and aiding in the cover-up of multiple crimes. The wedding meant to cement Robert's empire became the stage for its complete destruction. Guests who'd come to celebrate found themselves being questioned as witnesses, their connections to the criminal enterprise carefully documented. In the midst of the chaos, Brandon made one last desperate attempt to grab me, whether to use me as a hostage or simply to hurt me one final time. But Emma was ready. My 16-year-old sister, warrior in a bridesmaid dress, struck him with a champagne bottle, sending him stumbling into the arms of waiting agents. "That's for every girl you've hurt," she spat, and I'd never been prouder. The arrests continued for over an hour as the scope of the corruption was revealed. 17 people in total were taken into custody, the entire network Robert had built crumbling in a single morning. Mother sat through it all in shock, the medication preventing her from fully processing what was happening. But as they led Robert past her in handcuffs, something sparked in her eyes. 20 years of abuse, of living in fear, of watching her daughter nearly sold into slavery, all crystallized into a moment of clarity. "You'll never hurt us again," she said quietly, but everyone heard. Robert lunged toward her, but the agents held him back, his violent nature on full display for the cameras. That footage would play on every news channel, ensuring public opinion would offer him no sympathy. Grandfather orchestrated the media coverage masterfully. By evening, the story had gone national. Federal judge exposes son's criminal empire to save granddaughter. Every detail was laid bare: the destroyed Harvard acceptance, the forced marriage, the financial crimes, even suspicions about my grandmother's death. Harvard admissions, watching the news, released a statement that they would hold my place for the spring semester, understanding the extraordinary circumstances. The public response was overwhelming, with thousands of messages of support flooding social media. Robert Hartford had wanted a memorable wedding, and he'd gotten one, just not the kind he'd planned. The trials that followed were swift and decisive. Robert Hartford, faced with mountains of evidence and abandoned by his former associates who rushed to make plea deals, was convicted on all charges. The judge, one of grandfather's former colleagues, showed no mercy in sentencing. 25 years in federal prison, no possibility of parole for 15. I sat in the courtroom as the verdict was read, feeling not joy but a hollow relief. The man who'd terrorized our family for 2 decades was finally facing consequences. His empire built on threats and bribes collapsed completely, investigators uncovering more victims and crimes with each passing day. Brandon Mitchell's trial was equally satisfying. Lauren testified via video link, still too terrified to be in the same room with him even with armed guards present. 3 other women came forward with similar stories of assault and stalking. The recorded confession from our counseling session with Father Murphy proved devastating to his defense. 15 years in prison, with mandatory psychiatric treatment and lifetime registration as a sex offender. His family's construction business, tainted by association with criminal enterprise, folded within months. The compound he'd prepared for our married life was seized by federal authorities and ironically converted into a shelter for abuse survivors. The network of corruption my father had cultivated fell like dominoes. Councilman Morrison got 10 years for bribery and conspiracy. Dr. Brennan lost his medical license and served 5 years for falsifying medical records and insurance fraud. Father Murphy was defrocked and sentenced to 3 years for conspiracy, his congregation learning how he'd betrayed his sacred duties. Aunt Martha, who'd started this nightmare by revealing my college fund, found herself unemployed and ostracized. Even Mrs. Washington faced consequences, though grandfather advocated for leniency given her cooperation. She received probation and community service, which she fulfilled by helping other forced marriage victims. But the true revenge came in how grandfather handled the financial aftermath. Using his legal expertise, he'd positioned himself as a creditor to Robert's businesses before the arrests. When everything was liquidated to pay fines and restitution, William Hartford legally acquired all of Robert's assets for pennies on the dollar. The house I'd grown up in, the one Robert had planned to sell, was transferred to my mother's name free and clear. The construction company's legitimate contracts and equipment were sold, with proceeds going into a trust for Emma's education and my mother's medical care. Every penny Robert had hidden was recovered and redistributed to his victims. The Daniel Foster Trust Fund was finally released to me, its $2 million intact and waiting. But money felt insignificant compared to the gift of freedom. That spring, I walked through Harvard Yard as a freshman, my dreams delayed but not destroyed. The coursework was challenging, but after surviving Robert Hartford's tyranny, organic chemistry felt manageable. I threw myself into my studies with the hunger of someone who'd almost lost everything. My professors noted my maturity and drive, not knowing the price I'd paid for those qualities. I graduated summa cum laude 4 years later, my mother and sister cheering from the audience, grandfather wiping away proud tears. Law school followed naturally. I'd seen how the legal system could fail victims but also how it could deliver justice when wielded by those who understood its power. I specialized in family law and domestic violence cases, driven by the knowledge that other women were trapped as I'd almost been. My practice grew quickly, reputation spreading among those who needed an advocate who truly understood their fear. I never charged women fleeing abuse, funding their cases through the successful lawsuits against their abusers. Within 5 years, I'd helped over 100 women escape situations like mine, each victory healing something in my own soul. Mother's recovery took longer but was no less remarkable. The withdrawal from years of prescribed medications was brutal, but she faced it with courage I didn't know she possessed. Therapy helped her process 2 decades of abuse and rebuild her sense of self. 2 years after the trials, she met David Chen, a widowed therapist who volunteered at the same women's shelter where she'd begun helping others. Their courtship was gentle and respectful, everything her marriage to Robert hadn't been. When they married in a small ceremony in our backyard, she glowed with genuine happiness. Watching her dance at her second wedding, free and joyful, was worth everything we'd endured. Emma channeled her teenage fury into purpose. The girl who'd wielded a knife to protect me became a fierce advocate for justice. She earned a full scholarship to Yale, studying investigative journalism with a focus on exposing corruption. Her senior thesis on systematic abuse in small-town power structures won national awards. She never forgot those nights of recording evidence and building cases. Now she does it professionally, her byline appearing on articles that bring down corrupt officials and abusive systems. We joke that the Hartford women have become a crime-fighting dynasty, but there's truth beneath the humor. 5 years into my career, I received notice that Robert Hartford had been released early on a technicality, a paperwork error in his original arrest. My blood ran cold reading the letter, old fears resurging like phantom pain. But I wasn't 18 and helpless anymore. I had resources, allies, and most importantly, the law on my side. When he appeared at my office demanding I help him rebuild his life, claiming I owed him for raising me, I was ready. The restraining order was already filed, security cameras rolling, witnesses present. "You were never my father," I told him calmly. "You were just the man who stole my childhood." Security escorted him out as he raged about ungrateful daughters and stolen birthright. What followed was poetic justice in its purest form. Robert Hartford, stripped of all assets and connections, found himself homeless. His former associates wanted nothing to do with him. The construction industry blacklisted him completely. Even the homeless shelters I funded recognized his name and refused him entry, though they offered referrals to facilities in other cities. I would see him sometimes outside the courthouse where I argued cases, looking decades older than his years, holding a cardboard sign begging for help. I never acknowledged him, walking past in my designer suits toward my waiting Mercedes, living the successful life he'd tried to steal from me. The properties grandfather had acquired from Robert's seized assets became my project. I converted the construction company warehouses into transitional housing for women leaving abusive relationships. The office building became a legal aid center offering free representation. Each property that had once fueled his corruption now served to help his victims and others like them. The country club where my nightmare wedding almost occurred offered us their ballroom for fundraising galas supporting the shelters. Every year on June 15th, the anniversary of my near enslavement, we raise millions for survivors of domestic abuse. My grandfather lived to see all of this transformation. At 91, he still attended every charity gala, every graduation, every victory celebration. In his final days, he held my hand and told me that saving me had been his life's greatest accomplishment, worth more than any legal victory from his decades on the bench. He passed peacefully, knowing the Hartford name now stood for justice rather than corruption. His funeral was attended by hundreds whose lives he'd touched, including dozens of women who'd found freedom through the programs his courage had made possible. Today, at 32, I run one of the most successful victim advocacy law firms in the country. My mother lives in peace with her loving husband. Emma continues exposing corruption through her journalism. And somewhere on the cold streets, Robert Hartford survives on the kindness of strangers, experiencing the helplessness he once inflicted on others. I don't rejoice in his suffering, but I don't alleviate it either. Some might call it revenge, but I call it justice. My father was right about one thing, though not in the way he meant it. I didn't need that Harvard degree. I earned it. And then I used it to ensure no father could ever again tell his daughter that girls don't need degrees. The greatest revenge isn't cruelty or violence. It's becoming everything they said you couldn't be, achieving everything they tried to prevent, and using your success to prevent them from hurting anyone else. My grandfather understood this truth and taught it to me through example. Every woman who walks free from abuse, every girl who makes it to college despite family opposition, every survivor who finds their voice in court, they all carry forward the lesson of the Hartford revenge. We don't destroy our abusers. We simply remove their power and let them face the consequences of their choices. And then we build something beautiful from the ashes they left behind. What started as one young woman's fight for education became a movement that's helped thousands. The Harvard letter my father shredded has been reframed and hangs in my office, its pieces carefully reconstructed, a reminder that what seems destroyed can be rebuilt stronger. Below it hangs my law degree and a photo of grandfather, the man who proved that love is the most powerful force for justice. Robert Hartford wanted to own me. Instead, his actions created a warrior for women's rights. His greatest fear, a daughter with power, became reality through his own cruelty. And that, perhaps, is the most perfect revenge of all. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this story of survival and justice. Have you or someone you know faced similar challenges in pursuing education or escaping abuse? Please share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might help someone else find their courage. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more powerful narratives of triumph over adversity. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that there's always hope, even in the darkest situations. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and remember, your dreams are worth fighting for, no matter who tries to destroy them. Stay strong, and I'll see you in the next video.